Welcome to module number 4. In this module, we shall cover how to apply the 8 processes of risk management. So the learning outcomes of module 4 are broken down into 8 processes, and each of the processes is covered in a particular session. In session number 1, we will describe the purpose and the objectives of each process. In session number 2, we will start with the first process, wherein we define the context and objectives, and we demonstrate an understanding of that particular process. Session number 3, we would move on to the next one, wherein we would identify threats and opportunities, and we would demonstrate an understanding of that process. Session number 4 would cover prioritize risk process. Session number 5 would cover assess combined risk profile process. Session 6 covers plan responses process. Session 7 applies the agree contingency process and demonstrates an understanding of that particular process. 8 talks about monitoring and reporting progress process. And finally, session number 9, we would cover the review and adapt process and demonstrate an understanding of that particular process. So moving on to session number 1, wherein we would describe the purpose and objectives of each of the processes. So the first process that we're going to look into is the define context and objectives process. Now, if you look into this particular diagram, the outer layer of the diagram contains the 6 perspectives. Remember, we talked about each of those perspectives: portfolio perspective, program, operational, product, project, and strategic. These are the perspectives. And the next layer within the perspectives is your principles layer. We covered each of these principles. And then the next layer is the people layer. We would need to create a supportive risk culture, work with biases, individual competencies, and engaging stakeholders. And the last bit in the diagram, the last but one rather, is the process cycle. So we kind of are looking into each of these processes in slightly greater detail in this module. So we have define and context, define the context and objectives, identify threats and opportunities, prioritize risks, assess combined risk profile, plan responses, agree contingency, monitor and report progress, and review and adapt. These are the 8 processes. So we kind of are looking into the first process, wherein we define the context and the objectives. Now, the primary purpose of this particular process, which is define context as well as objectives process, is to ensure a good knowledge of the drivers for stakeholders in both the external as well as internal contexts, which is translated into a mutual understanding of what is at risk in a situation. It is a common error to identify risk prior to completing this process. Without a mutual understanding of the objectives at risk, there's a danger that the uncertainties which are identified are not related to the objectives. So a good starting point is to really know what the objectives of the initiative are. Once we know the objectives, then we could kind of go out and start identifying the risks that would impact the objectives. There's no risk if the uncertainty does not affect one or more of the defined objectives. Risk identification could be limited to people's perceptions without a good knowledge of the external and internal contexts and suitable stakeholders. So what are the main objectives of this process? The main objectives of this process are to ensure that a strategic risk management policy as well as process guide is described and communicated clearly and can be implemented over the organization. Clarity is established about what the risk management processes aspects can be tailored. Stakeholders are identified as well as engaged as related to the objectives as well as associated decisions. So these are the key objectives along with the other 2 on this particular slide. Assessment of the external as well as internal context is explicit. Oftentimes we ignore the external bit of understanding the context It could be industry regulations, the competitive environment. It could be the broader political landscape. So good to kind of assess the external context as well as the internal context. Objectives at risk are clear, and the capability and appetite for risk to those objectives is defined. The MO process cycle is expected to continue with time, where the process is being undertaken for a second or subsequent time. The objectives are to validate as well as refresh the information. So we move on to the next process, which is identify threats and opportunities. Please keep in mind that risk management not only focuses on the downside risks, which are your threats, but it also focuses on your upside risks, which are your opportunities. So the main purpose of this process is to ensure that stakeholders are engaged as well as share the risk perceptions to define objectives and their causes. These risks will be threats with a detrimental or downside effect on objectives. Others will be opportunities, risks with a beneficial or upside impact on objectives. It would not be anticipated to have an equal number of each. Well, sometimes you could have greater opportunities and greater and lesser threats, and at other times you could have greater threats and very lesser opportunities. Risk identification is a creative and divergent process when it performs well, intending to make risks explicit. This is a common error to attempt to constrain this process by questioning individuals to identify the main risks. Well, at the identification stage, it's good to be as comprehensive as possible, not just focus on the main ones. Main ones would be filtered out as a part of the assessment stage, but then as a part of the identification journey, it's good to be as comprehensive as possible. The risk prioritization comes in the following process. The process is regarding spending time identifying the risks which are knowable. This objective may be difficult or impossible in order to achieve, but required not to limit risk identification. So what are the main objectives of this process? The main objectives are to ensure that all the knowable risks are identified, focus on creating value by identifying opportunities, not just protecting value by identifying threats. Ownership for each and every defined risk is kind of agreed upon. So these are the objectives of the identify threats and opportunities process. Risks are described well, separating causes from risk events and impacts on one or more of the agreed objectives at risk. Always a good idea to capture your risk in the cause event impact or effect format. Let's say you could think about a particular machinery that we are using outdoors, let's say due to poor weather conditions, which is a cause, which is environmental in nature. The machine, let's say, that we are operating might malfunction. Again, remember, risk is an uncertain event, may not, and if it does malfunction, there's a consequence, resulting in a timeline delay, for example. And let's say one of the objectives of the project is to deliver on time. So it does definitely impact the objective of the project, and therefore good to kind of capture the risk in this particular format.